When my father passed away, he left his entire estate, company, house, land, to my younger brother. As for me, the illegitimate child seen as an outsider, I only received an old pickup truck in the garage. At first, I thought it was the ultimate insult. But then, when I checked the truck's GPS data, I discovered that my father frequently drove it to a remote location in the mountains. Same day, same time, for years on end. I couldn't understand what could have made him keep that secret until I followed those coordinates and uncovered a truth that made my blood run cold. Hello, my name is Apollo Bennett. I'm 29 years old, living alone in a small rented apartment in the heart of Ridgefield, Colorado. The apartment isn't anything special, just a cramped space with a small living room, an outdated kitchen corner, and a single bed pushed against the window. But for me, it's a place where I can breathe, where I don't have to face cold stares or words sharp as knives. I work at Charlie's Auto Repair Shop, a small garage at the end of Main Street where the smell of motor oil and the clanging of metal are my daily companions. The job isn't glamorous, but it keeps my mind clear, my hands busy, and my heart from dwelling too much on old wounds. I'm the illegitimate son of my mother, Avery Bennett, from her first marriage. I carry her last name, a name I've always been proud of, though it often comes with probing looks from others. My biological father? I don't know much about him, only what my mother told me a few times, that he left when I was too young to remember his face. Perhaps because of that, I grew up feeling like a misplaced puzzle piece in the family picture. When my mother remarried Pedro Morales, I thought things would change. I had hoped as a child dreams of a complete home, but that hope quickly evaporated like a drop of water on parched ground. Pedro Morales, my stepfather, 61 years old, is a man of Latin American descent. To me, he was a stone wall. Tall with a deep, heavy voice, he always carried the authoritative air of a patriarch. He valued bloodlines to an almost obsessive degree. Our family consisted of 4 people: me, my mother, my stepfather Pedro, and Hugo, my half-brother born to my mother and Pedro. We lived in a comfortable 2-story house in the suburbs of Ridgefield. It was a beautiful home, with a white picket fence, a lush green garden, and a spacious garage filled with the pickup trucks Pedro proudly called the family legacy. He owned Morales Logistics, a small transportation company passed down from his father. To Pedro, the company wasn't just a business, it was a symbol of honor, of the Morales lineage, something he spoke of with fiery eyes whenever the topic came up. He also frequently talked about Hugo, his golden son bearing the Morales name, the one he pinned all his hopes on to take over the company. And me? I was just the freeloader, as he once called me in a fit of anger. I don't entirely blame him for it, not really. I learned to accept that I didn't belong in his world, though my heart still ached every time I recalled the way he looked at me, as if I were a stranger he barely knew. My mother, Avery, is a kind woman, but I know she's been worn down after years of living in tension. At 58, she still retains the gentle air of a mother, but her eyes now carry a deep weariness. She used to be strong. I know this from the stories she told me about her youth when she raised me alone before meeting Pedro. But her marriage to him changed her. She loves me and Hugo equally, but the unfairness in our family, how Pedro treated me, how Hugo was spoiled, made her choose silence. I understand that she's afraid that if she speaks up, everything will fall apart. She's the only bridge between me and Pedro, but I feel that bridge is as fragile as a thread about to snap. Hugo, my younger brother, is 4 years my junior. He's the son Pedro always boasted about, spoiled to the point that I sometimes find him strangely naive. Hugo is confident, ambitious, but lacks life experience. He works at Morales Logistics, entrusted with important tasks by our father, though I know he's not truly ready to run an entire company. To me, Hugo isn't exactly a bad person. He doesn't have any overt malice, but his condescending attitude, the way he looks at me as if I'm an outsider not bearing the Morales name, makes me keep my distance. Once I overheard him joking with friends, calling me the unofficial brother. He laughed loudly, but I quietly turned away, feeling as though an invisible knife had lodged deep in my chest. As an adult living independently, I still visit my mother on weekends. During those visits, she hugs me tightly and smiles. Pedro, meanwhile, remains the same, stern and cold, just as I remember him. I'm not one to complain. I live a disciplined life, work hard, and hold on to my self-respect. I don't need Pedro's acceptance, but I can't deny that a childhood without a father's love left a deep wound in me. It doesn't flare up or scream, it smolders like a small flame burning endlessly in my chest. I've learned to live reservedly, speaking little. Not because I have nothing to say, but because I fear my words might hurt my mother, the only person who has always loved me unconditionally. In recent weeks, when I visited my mother, I noticed that Pedro was no longer the same. He used to be the man who hosted lavish parties at home, inviting friends over to drink and boast about Morales Logistics. But now he had become quiet. I heard from my mother that he frequently complained of chest pain, shortness of breath, and sometimes felt so exhausted that he had to sit down in the middle of work. One time, when I stopped by, I saw him sitting on the front porch, silent, staring out at the road leading into town. Those once sharp, authoritative eyes were now clouded. As if veiled by a layer of unease he was trying to hide. I didn't ask my mother much, but from the fragmented stories she shared, I knew Pedro had been to the hospital a few times. One afternoon, when I dropped by, I accidentally saw a medical report on his desk, the bolded words "chronic coronary artery disease" at the top of the page. Below it was a doctor's note: signs of myocardial ischemia, mild arrhythmia. Must avoid stress, high risk of heart attack. I stood frozen, feeling as though a heavy stone was pressing on my chest. I wasn't close to Pedro, but he was a part of my mother's life. If he were to fall, what would happen to her? And Hugo, with all his confidence and ambition, would he be strong enough to carry everything? Pedro rarely spoke about his condition. I understood why. He was a man who controlled everything, from finances and work to the smallest decisions in the family. Admitting weakness was tantamount to surrendering the power he had built his entire life. But his silence couldn't hide the truth. He was at risk of a stroke at any moment. I began to notice a new obsession in him, an obsession with legacy. Every time I visited, I heard him talk about Morales Logistics as if it were his flesh and blood. He spoke of Hugo with glowing eyes, calling him the heir, the pride of the Morales lineage. I wasn't surprised. Deep down, Pedro had never seen me as his son. I was Apollo Bennett, not Apollo Morales. I didn't carry the bloodline he revered. But every time he spoke of legacy and bloodline, I felt an old wound in my heart bleeding again, though I had tried to teach myself not to care. Then one evening, everything changed forever. That day, I received a text from my mother asking me to come over for a family dinner. I didn't enjoy those evenings, sitting around the table listening to Pedro talk about the company, watching Hugo laugh loudly while I just wanted to eat quickly and leave. But for my mother, I went anyway. When I stepped into the two-story house in the suburbs of Ridgefield, the smell of grilled meat and the soft sound of Latin music from an old speaker greeted me. My mother smiled, hugging me tightly, but I saw exhaustion in her eyes, as if she were trying to hold something together to keep it from shattering. We sat down at the table. Pedro, as always, was at the head, exuding the authority he had never lost, though his face looked more gaunt than before. Hugo sat to his right, excitedly talking about a new company contract. My mother sat across from me, her hands busy arranging plates of food, but her eyes kept darting to Pedro as if searching for something. I ate in silence, trying to ignore the familiar feeling of being out of place creeping up in my chest. Then Pedro suddenly stopped eating. He set his fork down, cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. "I need to say something," he began, his voice low and deliberate. "My time may not be long." I looked up, my heart pounding. My mother froze, her face paling, her hands stopping mid-motion. Hugo stared at his father, his eyes a mix of worry and confusion, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I didn't know how to react. Pedro continued, his tone reassuring. "It's not serious. It's just, I need to settle things before it's too late. I want to talk about the heir to my legacy." He went on, his voice growing firmer as if he had rehearsed these words 100 times in his mind. "My valuable assets, including my shares in Morales Logistics, my investment portfolio and the properties will all go to Hugo. He will take over and uphold the family's honor." He looked at Hugo, his eyes filled with expectation. "Avery, you will have a small savings account and the right to manage this house. And Apollo—" He paused, looking at me for the first time that evening. "I have an old pickup truck that's been with me for over 40 years. I'm leaving it to you." The air in the room seemed to solidify. No one spoke. I heard the faint clink of a fork against a plate, the ticking of the clock on the wall, but it all felt distant. My mother stared down at her plate, clenched tightly, her lips pressed together as if she wanted to say something but didn't dare. Hugo looked uneasy, his eyes flickering between Pedro and me as if he recognized the unfairness, but lacked the courage to speak up. And me? I sat still, my face calm, but inside a storm was raging. The old pickup truck. That was what he left for me. A worn-out relic, just like how he saw me. Something superfluous, not worth keeping. I wasn't angry. Not exactly. I was too used to being pushed to the sidelines. But the hurt surged up, smoldering like an old wound torn open. I remembered my childhood when I still tried to win his approval. At 7, I drew a birthday card scrawling "Dad" in messy handwriting on the cover, hoping he'd smile. But he only glanced at it, set it on the table, and said, "Don't call me that." At 12, I tried to help him fix a truck engine, only to be scolded for messing with grown-up things. After that, I never touched his belongings again. At every meal, he'd put his hand on Hugo's shoulder, laughing loudly as he talked about the company, then turned to me with a cold, indifferent look, as if I were an uninvited guest. When I graduated high school, I asked to work at Morales Logistics, thinking I could prove my worth. But he rejected me outright. "This company is for those who carry the Morales name." And whenever guests came over, he introduced Hugo as my son, and me as my wife's son from another man. In those moments, my mother would squeeze my hand under the table, but her comfort was never enough to erase the feeling of being abandoned. When dinner ended, I stood up, said goodbye to my mother, and left. I didn't look at Pedro or Hugo. I just wanted to get out of that house where I had never belonged. I drove through the quiet streets of Ridgefield, the dim streetlights reflecting on my windshield. I stopped in front of the auto shop where I work, the place where I feel I have worth. Sitting in my car, staring at the reflected lights, I felt a vast emptiness in my chest. Not anger, not resentment, but a suffocating void. I wasn't upset about the old pickup truck or being left out of Pedro's legacy. I was grieving because once again I realized I had never been considered part of the family. In the days following that evening, I tried to return to my daily routine. Every morning I woke up at dawn, brewed coffee in my small kitchen, and biked to Charlie's repair shop. The roar of engines and the familiar smell of motor oil and metal usually helped me push aside tangled thoughts. But this time, they weren't enough. The image of my mother at the dinner table, head bowed, hands clenched tightly, haunted me. I worried for her, worried that her silence was slowly consuming her heart, just as it had once done to mine. I noticed Pedro starting to act strangely, as if he were hiding something I couldn't ignore. On weekends, he would leave the house early, often when the morning mist still hung in the air, and return late after the streetlights were glowing brightly. He drove the old pickup truck, the one he called my private legacy. I had assumed he no longer used it, but it turned out he still did. What was concerning was that I saw him lock the garage door tightly every time he left, not allowing anyone to touch the truck. It struck me as odd because Pedro was never one for such trivial precautions. There was something in the way he moved, in his quiet, tense gaze, that sparked an unsettling premonition in me, as if a secret were lurking somewhere waiting for me to uncover it. One weekend morning when I visited my mother, Pedro unexpectedly called me out to the garage. I was surprised. He rarely spoke to me directly except for brief commands. He stood beside the old pickup truck, arms crossed, his eyes avoiding mine. "Apollo," he said, his voice low and slightly hurried. "The truck's acting up. Can you fix it?" I nodded, not asking questions. Despite our distant relationship, I didn't want to refuse, knowing it would upset my mother if I caused tension. I brought my toolbox, popped the hood, and started inspecting the engine. But when I sat in the driver's seat to check the electrical system, I glanced at the GPS screen. A strange location appeared, logged multiple times in the navigation history. It wasn't the Morales Logistics office or any delivery point I knew. The location was in Deer Valley, a remote hunting area, a desolate forest with few visitors. I frowned, a sense of unease rising in my chest. Why would Pedro go to a place like that not once but regularly? I discreetly snapped a photo of the coordinates on my phone, keeping my expression neutral so he wouldn't suspect anything. When I finished fixing the truck, Pedro merely nodded, offered no thanks, and quickly locked the garage again, as if afraid I might see something. All day, those coordinates haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about them. What was Pedro hiding in that remote place? A shady deal related to the company, or something worse? I thought of my mother, of the anxious look in her eyes every time Pedro left the house at odd hours. I thought of the way he cleaned the truck's cargo bed with a tense expression, the faint smell of gasoline and metal wafting from it. My suspicion grew like a smoldering fire. I couldn't just stand by, couldn't let my mother live in unease without knowing why. I had to find out. The next afternoon, when I was sure Pedro was busy at the company office, I decided to act. I drove my own beat-up pickup truck, following the coordinates on my phone. The road to Deer Valley's hunting area was rough, shaded by towering pine trees. The air was cold, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp earth. I drove slowly, my heart pounding, trying to stay calm. After nearly an hour, I reached a narrow trail, almost hidden by overgrown trees. I parked my truck behind a cluster of vines, turned off the engine, and stepped out, carrying a flashlight and an unshakable sense of unease. I walked along the trail, my footsteps light on the soft ground. At the end of the path, I saw it, a small wooden cabin nestled among the pines. Smoke drifted from the chimney, faint but unmistakable, as if someone regularly used the place. My heart tightened. This wasn't a place for checking inventory. I hid behind a large tree, observing. Through the cabin's cloudy window, I saw a faint light inside, but no sign of Pedro. The cabin was quiet, but the silence was eerie, as if it were concealing a terrifying secret. I stood there, my breath mingling with the cold air, waiting. Time crawled by like a nightmare. The wind whistled through the pine branches, mixed with faint metallic sounds from inside, sharp, unclear in origin. I wondered what Pedro had been doing here. Hiding money, contraband, or something far worse. I wanted to turn back, to pretend I'd never seen those coordinates, but I couldn't. Not out of curiosity, but for my mother. If Pedro was hiding something, I needed to know, for her, for the truth she deserved. I crept closer to the cabin, my heart pounding. The front door was secured with an old padlock, but I didn't dare pry it open yet. I stood still, watching the smoke rise from the chimney, feeling as though an invisible hand were squeezing my chest. I didn't know what was inside that cabin, but the unsettling premonition was clearer than ever. I drove back to my apartment. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the wooden cabin, the coordinates on the GPS, and Pedro's tense gaze replayed in my mind over and over. In the nights that followed, the image of the wooden cabin haunted me like a shadow. Sometimes I dreamed it concealed a hidden treasure, something my stepfather had deliberately kept secret for years. But other nights, the dreams turned darker. I saw my mother trapped in that cabin, pounding on the door, pleading for help in vain. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat, my heart racing wildly. I knew I couldn't keep living with this suspicion. Finally, I decided to act. I chose a day when I was certain Pedro would be tied up in meetings and stay late at the office. Early that morning, I prepared a few tools, a pair of pliers, a lock-picking kit, and a small flashlight, items I hoped would help me unlock that mysterious door. I drove back up to the mountains, the winding road cutting through mist-covered pines. When I arrived, I stopped, turned off the engine, and heard only the whistle of the wind through the trees. The wooden cabin emerged from the fog, silent and cold. No smoke rose from the chimney, and the front door was locked tight, as if no one had ever set foot inside. I approached, my heart pounding in my chest, each step heavier than the last. Standing before the door, I took a deep breath, pulled out my tools, and began prying the lock. My mind consumed by a single thought. No matter what it was, I had to know the truth. The door finally swung open, creaking dryly in the forest's silence. A rush of cold air poured out, carrying the musty smell of damp wood mixed with a sharp, metallic scent like old blood. I froze. A chill ran down my spine. I raised my flashlight. Its faint beam swept across a narrow hallway, illuminating dark wooden walls. Everything inside was suspiciously tidy. A small gas stove with traces of soot, neatly folded blankets on a chair, a few cans of food and water bottles arranged precisely on a shelf. This wasn't an abandoned place. Someone had been here, and was still coming back regularly. But who? And why choose to stay in this eerie, isolated forest? I walked down the hallway, my heart beating harder with each step. I stopped at the first room, the one I'd seen Pedro enter most often. The door was secured with a large padlock, bigger than any I'd seen in an ordinary house. I grabbed my pliers and lock-picking tools, my hands trembling slightly as I worked. Each metallic clank sounded like a warning, but I couldn't stop. Finally, the lock gave way and the wooden door swung open. But behind it was a thick iron door, reinforced with sturdy bars like a prison cell. My heart nearly stopped. Through the faint light of my flashlight, I saw a figure moving inside. I stepped closer, and a girl's face appeared behind the bars. She looked about 18, gaunt with disheveled hair and wide, terrified eyes. Her clothes were clean but worn, as if she'd been wearing them for months. The room was small, unnervingly orderly, with only a bed, a thin blanket, and a few water bottles on a table. When she saw me, she rushed to the bars, gripping them tightly, her trembling voice pleading, "Please, help me. Please." Her words cut through my chest like a knife. I stood frozen, my feet rooted to the floor. My entire body went numb, my heart pounding, unable to believe what I was seeing. Who was this girl? And why was she locked up here? I stammered, trying to calm her. "Stay calm, I'll come back, I promise." My voice shook, unsure if I was speaking to her or myself. I stepped back, my mind reeling, but I knew I couldn't stop. I continued down the hallway to the two remaining rooms. Both were locked from the outside with the same structure. Wooden doors followed by iron bars like a meticulously designed prison. Inside each was another girl, one about 22, the other around 25. They were also gaunt, also terrified, their pleading eyes mirroring the first girl's. Each room had a bed, a blanket, food, and water. Just enough to sustain life, nothing more. This wasn't a shelter. It was a prison hidden deep in the forest. I stumbled back to the porch, my legs shaking so much I had to grip the doorframe. The freezing forest air couldn't ease the suffocating feeling in my chest. I tried to breathe, but my chest felt constricted. What I had just seen surpassed anything I could have imagined. Pedro, the man I called my stepfather, the man my mother trusted, what was he doing in this cabin? Who were these girls? And why? I wanted to deny it, to believe I'd seen wrong, but their desperate eyes, their trembling pleas couldn't be fake. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. I dialed Pedro's number, unsure what I expected from the call. The ringing was long and cold, pulling me deeper into a nightmare. When he picked up, his voice was calm but carried a hint of tension. "Apollo? What's wrong?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm at the cabin in the woods. I've seen everything. There was a pause for a few seconds. Then Pedro's voice came through, tinged with surprise, even a hint of unease. "What cabin?" I replied slowly. "The one you go to every week." "In Deer Valley." Another long silence followed. When Pedro spoke again, his tone had changed. Lower, tense, with a slight tremor. "You're there?" Then he continued. "You're mistaken. There's nothing there. Go back." I couldn't hold back anymore. "Don't lie to me. 3 girls locked in those rooms." "I saw them, Pedro. They begged me for help." My voice cracked, half angry, half panicked. Another silence, but this time I heard his rapid breathing through the phone. When he spoke again, his voice was different, lower, urgent, tinged with fear. "Apollo, listen to me. Don't do anything. Don't go anywhere. I'm coming to explain. You don't understand." "What are you hiding here, Pedro?" I asked, my voice hoarse. A sharp exhale came through as if he'd gripped the phone tightly. "Don't do anything stupid. I'm begging you. Stay there. I'm on my way." The call ended. All that remained was the sound of the forest and my heartbeat pounding in my chest. Explain. The word echoed in my mind, but it meant nothing. No explanation could justify what I'd just seen. I hung up, still clutching the phone as if it were the only thing keeping me from collapsing. The wind howled through the forest, carrying a bone-chilling cold, but I felt nothing except the horror strangling my heart. I stood there in the darkness, knowing I had just opened a door that could never be closed again. My instincts screamed, urging me to act immediately. I couldn't just stand there, waiting for Pedro to arrive with his explanation. I took a deep breath, trying to suppress the trembling in my chest, and turned back to the hallway. The flashlight's beam swept across the aged wooden walls. I returned to the first room where the young girl was imprisoned. The thick iron door, secured with an industrial lock and 2 welded steel bars, looked designed to ensure no one could escape. I tried shaking the hinges, but they didn't budge. This kind of lock could only be broken with a cutting tool, which I hadn't brought. I leaned close to the bars, my eyes meeting the girl's panicked gaze. "Don't be afraid," I said, my voice hoarse with tension. "I'll help you. But I need to know. What happened? Who did this?" The girl clung to the bars, her nails scraping against the metal, producing sharp, chilling sounds that made me shudder. Her voice was broken, each word a struggle to escape. I was promised a job in Denver. An older man, brought me here. Then he locked me up. I don't know where I am. Please, get me out." Each word she spoke stabbed into my chest like a knife. She explained that there were 3 of them, all lured with promises of jobs or help. They didn't know where they were, only that an older man came a few times a week, bringing food and water. The door only opened when he arrived. Then her voice dropped to a near whisper. She revealed something that made my blood run cold. He forced them to serve his physical needs every time he visited. The oldest girl in another room had once tried to break the lock, but was beaten and isolated for days. After that, no one dared resist again. I stepped back, my mind reeling. I didn't want to believe it, but every detail pointed to Pedro. The older man, the pickup truck, the secret cabin. I felt horrified, not only by what he'd done, but also by the shame. He was my stepfather, the man my mother had lived with for over 20 years. The man she trusted, despite his harshness and control. I continued down the hallway, checking the other 2 rooms. Each was a replica of the same horror: iron doors, bars, and girls with desperate eyes. They told similar stories. Lured, locked up, abused. Every word tore at my heart, making me feel as though I too was imprisoned, not behind bars, but within the brutal truth about my family. I stumbled back to the porch, trying to breathe, but the forest's frigid air couldn't ease the suffocating feeling. My chest felt constricted, my mind blank. I couldn't comprehend Pedro, the man I'd thought was merely cold and patriarchal, doing this. I thought of my mother, her gentle eyes, the way she always tried to keep peace in the family. If this truth came to light, she would collapse. She wouldn't be able to bear knowing the husband she loved was a monster. But if I stayed silent, if I turned away and pretended I hadn't seen anything, what would I become? An accomplice? A coward? The idea of waiting for Pedro's explanation became absurd, repulsive. No explanation could justify what I had just witnessed. In that fleeting moment, I stood at the crossroads of pity and rage. I pitied my mother, the years she sacrificed to keep this family intact. But I also hated Pedro, hated his deceit. I knew I had to choose, and though that choice would destroy my family, I couldn't turn my back on the girls imprisoned here. I had to stand on the right side, no matter the cost. I stepped away from the cabin, pulled out my phone, my hands shaking so much I had to grip it with both. I dialed the emergency line, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. I need to report an illegal detention at a cabin in the woods in Deer Valley. There are 3 girls locked inside. Please, send a task force immediately. The operator asked a few questions and I answered, trying to keep my voice steady, but each word felt heavy as lead. When I hung up, I returned to the hallway, looking through the bars to reassure the girls. The police are coming. You'll be safe. I promise. But their eyes, though flickering with hope, were still filled with fear, as if they didn't dare believe in freedom. I stepped back out to the porch, standing silently, staring at the cabin. My chest felt heavy, as if the weight of the world rested on my shoulders. The wind howled through the forest, mingling with the faint tapping sounds from inside, the sounds of desperation awaiting release. I looked up at the sky, where the dim light of dusk was fading. I knew from this moment I had changed. No longer just the man on the sidelines of the Morales family, but someone who dared to face the truth, no matter how painful. Less than 20 minutes after I hung up with the police, the familiar rumble of a pickup truck echoed from the trail. Headlights pierced through the fog, their blinding beams sweeping across the pine trees as if tearing through the night. The truck screeched to a stop in front of the porch, tires grinding against the dirt with a harsh sound. Pedro stepped out, his face pale, his jacket stained with patches of sweat. His eyes, usually sharp and authoritative, now betrayed raw panic like a cornered animal. He scanned the surroundings, his gaze locking onto the pried-open front door. I saw his shoulders tense as if he realized everything had collapsed. I stood on the porch, our eyes meeting. In that moment, I saw fear, anger, and desperation swirling in his gaze. He approached, his steps slow but heavy, each one seeming to require immense effort. "Apollo," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, but I could hear it tremble. "It's not what you think. Listen to me, we can fix this." I took a step back, my gaze cold. "Fix it?" I repeated, my voice hoarse with the anger rising in my chest. "Fix what, Pedro? Why did you lock 3 girls in those rooms? Why were they begging me for help?" I didn't want to shout, but my voice broke as if all the years of suppressed pain were now erupting. Pedro froze, his face draining of color. I saw his hands clench as if trying to hold something back. "You don't understand," he said, his voice growing louder, tinged with desperation. "You're destroying this family, Apollo. Do you want your mother to suffer? Do you want Hugo to lose everything?" He stepped forward quickly, close enough that I could feel his rapid breathing. "Family?" I let out a bitter laugh. "What family, Pedro? The one you never considered me a part of?" I shook my head, feeling a fire burning in my chest. "I've called the police. They're on their way. It's over." Pedro's eyes widened, his fear turning to rage. "The police?" he roared, his voice echoing in the stifling air of the cabin. Before I could react, he lunged, yanking the phone from my hand. It fell to the floor with a sharp crack. "You don't understand anything," he shouted, his face flushed, veins bulging on his neck. Then everything descended into chaos. Pedro shoved me hard and I stumbled back, crashing into the wooden wall. The sound of furniture toppling rang out as a nearby chair tipped over. I tried to stand, but he was stronger than I expected. He pinned me to the floor, his hands clamping around my throat, his eyes blazing like embers. You don't understand, he bellowed, his voice breaking, almost pleading. You're ruining everything. I struggled, grabbing his sinewy arms, trying to push him off. The air was being squeezed from my lungs, my head spinning. In a fleeting moment, instinct took over. I swung my arm, landing a reflex punch to his face. Pedro staggered back, hitting the edge of the table, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. He gasped for air, his eyes a mix of hatred and desperation. I was breathing heavily too, standing up, my hands trembling. We stared at each other, silent, as if all the years of unspoken words and unhealed wounds had exploded in this cabin. Just then the wail of police sirens cut through the night, sharp and piercing. Flashes of red and blue lights sliced through the forest like blades of light. Pedro froze, his breathing ragged, his face crumbling as he realized it was over. The sirens grew closer, accompanied by the roar of engines and the sound of hurried footsteps. The police burst in, guns drawn, shouting, "Hands up, don't move." I stepped back, raising my hands, my heart still pounding. Pedro tried to say something, his voice faltering. "You've got it all wrong. I didn't." But his words were cut off as two officers tackled him, pinning him to the floor and cuffing his hands. The lock-breaking team rushed into the hallway. The sound of metal clanging echoed as they pried open the iron locks. The three girls were brought out, panicked, eyes brimming with tears, their bodies exhausted. They clung to each other, sobbing, their gazes a mix of gratitude and fear as they looked at me. I stood there, unable to speak, feeling as though my chest was being crushed. Pedro slumped to the ground, hands cuffed, his eyes empty. He muttered something, but I couldn't make it out. Perhaps a final attempt at justification, or just the whisper of a man who had lost everything. The police car's lights illuminated his face, the man who was once powerful, now reduced to a criminal. We were taken to the police station to give statements. That entire night, I sat in a harshly lit room alongside the three rescued girls, while Pedro was held in a cell nearby. The rustling of paper and pens, the steady clack of police boots on the cold tile floor, all blended into a jarring symphony of a reality I wasn't ready to accept as true. When I signed the final statement, dawn was approaching. The pale light of morning stretched across the empty streets of Ridgefield, but it brought no warmth. My body was exhausted, my mind reeling from fatigue. And in my thoughts, images swirled relentlessly. The girl's panicked eyes, Pedro's desperate shouts, and the moment he was handcuffed and led away through the iron door. I didn't want to return to my empty apartment, where only the sound of the wind and loneliness awaited. My mind was consumed by a single thought: my mother. She still knew nothing of the nightmare that had unfolded, and I couldn't let her hear it from someone else. I drove through the thin morning mist, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, struggling to stay alert. My cheeks were scratched and stinging from the struggle with Pedro. My shirt was covered in forest dust and dried blood. Mine or his, I wasn't sure anymore. When I pulled up in front of the two-story house in the suburbs, the kitchen light was still on, a faint glow in the darkness. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, each step feeling like it carried the weight of a boulder. The front door opened before I could knock. My mother stood there, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen as if she'd been awake all night. When she saw me, disheveled, clothes in disarray, she froze, her hand covering her mouth. "Apollo, what happened?" Her voice trembled with worry. I lowered my head, not answering right away, only murmuring, "I'm okay, Mom. I just need to sit for a bit." I stepped inside, collapsing onto the familiar sofa, my hands clenched, staring blankly out the window. Outside, the sky was beginning to brighten, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the curtains, but I felt no hope. My mother poured me a glass of water, her hands trembling slightly. She sat across from me, her voice softening as she tried to stay calm. "Is there something you're not telling me, Apollo?" She looked at me, her eyes pleading for an explanation, but also filled with fear of what she was about to hear. I took a deep breath, my voice hoarse as I began. "Mom, I went to a cabin in the woods in Deer Valley. I followed Pedro there. I paused, watching her, seeing her eyes falter when I mentioned his name. There, I found 3 girls. They were locked in rooms with iron bars. They were being held by Pedro, imprisoned, abused. Each word felt like a knife to the heart, and my voice grew shakier. I told her about tracking him, the iron doors, the cries for help, and the moment the police stormed in, taking Pedro away in handcuffs. "It can't be," she whispered, her voice breaking. The glass of water slipped from her hand, shattering on the tile floor with a sharp sound that echoed in the silent room. She collapsed into the chair, tears streaming down her face. "It can't be," she repeated, as if trying to convince herself it was a nightmare. Then she fell into my arms, fainting, her body trembling like a leaf in a storm. I carried her to her room, laid her on the bed, and placed a warm cloth on her forehead. That entire morning I sat silently by her side, listening to the ticking of the clock, each second marking the collapse of our family. When she woke, she said nothing, just stared at the ceiling, tears silently rolling down her face. I wanted to say something to comfort her, but no words could ease this pain. We sat there in choking silence, like 2 survivors of an explosion, unsure how to move forward. That afternoon, the real storm hit. Local news channels began reporting. Businessman Pedro Morales, owner of Morales Logistics, arrested on suspicion of kidnapping and detaining 3 women in a remote area of Ridgefield, Colorado. The police announced they were investigating the scene and expanding the inquiry. The media quickly dug up every detail, exposing family ties, naming the company, my mother, Hugo, and even me. The news spread like wildfire, social media flooded with images, comments, and ruthless judgments. "A monster," they called Pedro. "A sick family," they said about us. Hugo became the center of criticism. He tried to speak out on social media, posting a shaky status. "It's all a misunderstanding. My father isn't that kind of man." But his tone lacked conviction, as if he himself was beginning to doubt the father he had idolized his entire life. Each post, each comment was like a knife slashing at the family's honor. Hugo slowly realized the truth, that Pedro, the father he admired, was a criminal. Morales Logistics had its accounts frozen, employees quit in droves, and Hugo's close friends began to distance themselves. In just a few days, the pride and status Pedro had built for him crumbled into dust. Hugo withdrew, refusing to leave the house or respond to anyone. The 2-story house now stood eerily silent, like a tomb for the days gone by. My mother sank into a state of silent shock. She no longer cried but stopped eating, sitting for hours by the window, staring blankly at the garden. I tried to care for her, cleaning the house, cooking meals she barely touched. I tried to maintain the old routine, but everything had changed. A storm of conflicting emotions raged within me. I knew I had done the right thing, calling the police, freeing those girls, but I also felt guilt. It was my hand that ended the life of the man my mother trusted. It was I who pushed this family into the abyss. 3 days after the arrest, when I thought nothing could make things worse, a new wave crashed over us. The Ridgefield police expanded their investigation around the cabin. I heard through a friend in town that they brought ground-penetrating radar and K9 units to the Deer Valley forest. They combed every meter of land, as if certain something else was buried there. Then, on a cold afternoon, they discovered a patch of ground about 30 meters from the cabin, where the earth showed signs of having been disturbed. I wasn't there, but I could imagine the scene. Officers carefully digging, each shovel of damp soil revealing a secret more horrifying than anything I had already witnessed. They uncovered a set of skeletal remains, heavily decomposed, reduced to a grayish-white frame, a few scraps of rotted clothing, and a watch engraved with RM. DNA testing later confirmed what no one dared believe. The remains belonged to Raul Morales, Pedro's father, reported missing nearly a decade ago. When this news reached me, it felt like the ground beneath my feet collapsed. Pedro, the man who had imprisoned 3 girls whom I had thought was merely cold and patriarchal, might have murdered his own father. I sat in my small apartment, staring out the window, trying to comprehend, but my mind was a painful void. Days later, the media reported that Pedro Morales had confessed to his crimes during his first interrogation. According to the police, it stemmed from a dispute over inheritance and assets. That evening, the television broadcast a police statement. In addition to charges of kidnapping and unlawful detention, suspect Pedro Morales is now facing first-degree murder charges, with the victim identified as his father. The news spread like wildfire, shaking the entire town of Ridgefield. People whispered in grocery stores, coffee shops, and on the streets I used to walk. They called Pedro a murderer, a monster. And our family, my mother, Hugo, and I, became the focus of curious stares and harsh judgments. My mother watched the news on the old TV in the living room. As the anchor's voice rang out, she broke into sobs, her hands covering her face. "No, it can't be," she repeated, as if saying it enough times would make the truth disappear. She had lived with Pedro for over 20 years, shared a bed, meals, and moments that seemed peaceful. How could she believe that the man she loved had killed his own father? I sat beside her, wanting to hold her, to say something, but my throat tightened. I could only hold her hand, feeling her trembling, ice-cold fingers. Hugo collapsed in a different way. My mother told me he smashed his phone after reading the online articles, screaming in desperation before locking himself in his darkened room for hours. He had idolized Pedro, seeing him as an unshakable mountain. Now that mountain had crumbled, leaving Hugo lost amid the rubble. I didn't blame him. Hugo wasn't as strong as he always pretended to be. He was a product of Pedro's indulgence and expectations, and now, with everything shattered, he didn't know who he was anymore. I was different. I sat silently, staring at the TV screen, feeling as though my heart was being crushed. I had hated Pedro for how he treated me, for excluding me from the family, but I never imagined he could be this cruel. A kidnapper, an abuser, and now a murderer. I tried to sift through my memories, searching for any clue about Raul Morales. I didn't have many memories of him. He was a quiet, simple man who appeared only a few times in my childhood. But I clearly remembered one afternoon when I was 11. He took me for a walk around the Morales Logistics garage, smiling as he said, "When I'm gone, I'll leave everything to a children's cancer charity. Money shouldn't sit idle in a safe." At the time, I didn't fully understand, thinking it was just the odd talk of an old man. But looking back now, I realized it might have been the root of everything. Pedro, with his greed and blind pride in the Morales lineage, likely couldn't accept his father giving the family fortune to charity. He fabricated a story that Raul had gone away for treatment to cover up his crime. The thought chilled me to the bone. I had lived in this family under the same roof as a murderer, completely unaware. My mother was consumed by relentless guilt. She wasn't just grieving the loss of her husband, but tormented by the realization that she had been blind for years, living beside a killer without knowing. She sat for hours by the window, her eyes vacant as if her soul had left her body. I tried to be there for her, cooking meals she wouldn't touch, cleaning a house now stiflingly silent. But I couldn't ease her pain, just as I couldn't ease my own. Hugo spiraled into a deeper crisis. A week after the news broke, he was hospitalized for severe anxiety and depression. My mother told me he wasn't sleeping or eating, just sitting in his room, muttering as if talking to himself. I wanted to visit him, but she said Hugo didn't want to see anyone, not even me. I didn't blame him. I knew what it felt like when the world turned its back, when trust shattered like glass. I took on the role of caring for my mother and handling the remaining legal matters. Meetings with lawyers, questions from the police, paperwork related to Morales Logistics' frozen assets. But inside, I was an empty abyss. Each night I stood on the porch staring at the pitch-black sky, wondering who I had become after all this. I knew I had done the right thing, but the cost of the truth was too high. Our family, or what was left of it, was now just broken fragments, impossible to piece back together. 6 months after Pedro's arrest, his trial took place at the Ridgefield County Courthouse. It drew the attention of the entire state of Colorado, spreading like an unstoppable oil spill. Dozens of reporters gathered outside the courthouse, cameras flashing, microphones raised, and crowds of onlookers whispered among themselves, their eyes filled with curiosity and judgment. I didn't attend the trial. I couldn't face Pedro, couldn't bear to look at the man who was once the center of my family, now reduced to a shadow behind bars. But my mother recounted it to me through choked whispers that Pedro was no longer the authoritative man she once knew. He sat there, head bowed, face gaunt, his eyes vacant as if his soul had abandoned him. The prosecutor presented the evidence with cold precision. 3 counts of kidnapping, brutal acts of assault, and first-degree murder of Raul Morales, his own father. They read the victims' testimonies, each word slicing through the air like a blade. They revealed the DNA results from the skeletal remains found behind the cabin. Pedro didn't defend himself or deny the charges. He remained silent, his gaze dull, as if he had accepted his fate. At the end of the trial, the court sentenced him to life in prison without parole. A cold, fitting conclusion, but one that could never heal the wounds he left behind. The news of the verdict swept through Ridgefield like a storm. Morales Logistics, the company Pedro once proudly called the family legacy, collapsed in its wake. The court ordered the seizure of all related assets for a financial investigation. Partners canceled contracts, trucks were impounded, and bank accounts were frozen. The company's office in Ridgefield's commercial district, where Hugo once worked with pride, was now just an empty building, its doors locked tight, the Morales Logistics sign covered in dust. The family's 2-story house with its white picket fence and lush garden was repossessed by the bank to settle debts. In just 3 months, a once stable business, Morales Logistics, officially declared bankruptcy, leaving a void in the town and in the hearts of those who knew it. Hugo couldn't withstand the shock. After the verdict, he vanished from public view. The relentless pressure of public opinion, the unending criticism on social media, and the weight of guilt pushed him into a bottomless abyss. A friend of Hugo's told me he once said, his voice breaking, "I can't live in a place where every look reminds me of him." I understood that feeling, the sense of being trapped in your own past. One morning, Hugo left a brief note on the kitchen table, written in trembling handwriting. "Don't look for me. I need to go far away to learn how to breathe again." He left Ridgefield without a goodbye, without a trace. Only once, months later, did my mother receive a postcard from Seattle with a short message. "I'm okay." I looked at the postcard in her hand, my heart heavy. I didn't know if Hugo was truly okay, but I hoped he would find some small piece of peace. My mother and I couldn't stay in Ridgefield either. When the legal proceedings concluded, she was left with only a small savings account and my old car, the only things not seized. She decided to sell the remaining personal assets, pay off the outstanding debts, and looked at me with weary but resolute eyes. "We don't belong here anymore, Apollo," she said. I nodded, needing no further explanation. We left Ridgefield, carrying a few suitcases of clothes and the fragments of a family we once thought was whole. We moved to a small town on the outskirts of Denver, renting a modest single-story house with a red-tiled roof and a small front garden. Our new life was simple, free of prestige, without the noisy parties or the glamour of Morales Logistics. But it was truly ours. No more lies, no more horrific secrets. Just my mother and me, and quiet days where I heard her softly hum as she watered the flowers, where I found some comfort in fixing cars for the neighbors. Sometimes I still dream of the cabin in the Deer Valley woods. In those dreams, I see the iron doors again, hear the cries for help, and see the panicked eyes of the girls. Each time I wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat, sitting by the window, silently staring outside. I think about the cost of the truth. It freed the innocent but tore my family apart. I wonder if I could have done things differently, but the answer is always no. I chose the right path, even if it left me with a scar that will never heal. A year has passed since we left Ridgefield. My mother and I now live in a small town near Denver, in a rented house just over 70 square meters. It's not large or luxurious, but it's always filled with light from wide windows and the soft hum of music from my mother's old radio. Every morning I see her on the porch holding a watering can, tending to the beds of daisies and lavender she planted. She does so with a tenderness I rarely saw in our Ridgefield years, as if each petal is a piece of peace she's trying to rebuild. I bike to a repair shop a few blocks away where people know me simply as Apollo, the quiet, reliable mechanic. No one here asks about my past, and I don't bring it up. I like the way they see me. Not as Avery Bennett's illegitimate son, not as the outsider in the Morales family, but as a hard-working man always ready to help. I fix cars, wipe the grease from my hands, and find some comfort in the roar of engines. It reminds me that I can still build something with my hands, no matter how shattered the past may be. I'm no longer the silent, resentful man I once was. Back in Ridgefield, I let hatred and hurt imprison me, a shadow quietly passing through my mother's and Hugo's lives. But now I've learned to forgive. Not Pedro, never him, but myself. I realize that holding on to resentment only turned my heart to stone. The wounds are still there, but they're no longer open, bleeding sores. They've become scars, reminding me what matters. My mother, the truth, and the compassion I chose to uphold. I keep working hard, but not just to make a living. I've started helping the community in my own way, fixing cars for free for those in need, like the elderly woman living alone at the end of the street or the young family struggling to pay bills. Each time I see their grateful smiles, I feel like I'm restoring a piece of the humanity that my family, or rather Pedro, had lost. I call it my way of atoning for the mistakes of the past, not mine, but those of the world I was once part of. Looking back, I see that truth is a double-edged sword. It destroyed my family, tore apart what I once thought was a home. But it was also the only way for us to start anew, clean and free of lies. I carry the Bennett name, once seen as an outsider in the Morales family. But it was I, who didn't share Pedro's blood, who salvaged the last shred of honor for that name by confronting his crimes. I learned that blood doesn't define a person's dignity. Only our actions and choices do. I chose to stand for what was right, even if it meant losing the family I once longed to belong to. At a small community gathering at the repair shop, a neighbor asked me, "Apollo, what did you learn from your hardest years?" I paused, looking at the friendly faces around me, and said, my voice low but steady, "Don't fear loss, because sometimes losing everything shows you what's truly yours." I took a breath and continued, "If you uncover a truth that breaks your heart, don't turn away. Silence is complicity. And live with integrity, no matter the cost. Because sometimes justice isn't just about punishing the wicked. It's about having the courage not to become them." Those words weren't just for them. They were a promise to myself. One late afternoon, I drove my old truck along a mountain road, not to escape, but to say goodbye to the past. I stopped, stepped out, and stood watching the sunset blanket the pine forest. The wind carried the scent of resin, stirring memories of the cabin in the woods, now just a faded recollection. In that moment, I understood that peace doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from daring to face and let go. I gave a faint smile, turned the truck back toward the road leading to our small house where my mother was waiting, where a new life lay ahead. No one chooses where they're born, but everyone can choose how they live. I've chosen my path. One marked by scars but leading to light. And as I drove home under the glowing sunset sky, I knew I wouldn't lose my way again. This road is mine, and I'll keep walking it. For my mother, for those I saved, and for myself, the man who found peace among the wreckage.